And thank you for inviting me to talk about this important topic around rent control and housing overall. My name is Kelvin Brown, and I'm running for the Ward 7 council member seat. A little bit about my group background. I grew up in a very poor household. I was raised by a single mother with 7 other brothers. And really at a very young age, my mother taught us the value of an education and the value of service and giving back to our communities. And so I was able to take that information, actually graduate high school early, receive a scholarship to attend college because my family was impoverished and we couldn't pay for it. And today I'm happy to have a Bachelor's of Science in Criminal Law and a Master's degree in Business Administration. And so for the last 10 years, I've been working in affordable housing, advocating for rent control policies and increasing the overall access to credit for African American and minority communities across Ward 7 and across the country. And in my current role there, I manage a multi-million-dollar portfolio with Fannie Mae that's focused specifically on those 3 issues, but also looking at innovation in housing and how can we stimulate the economy and stimulate our moral compass across the country to make sure we add to the housing supply, but also make sure we preserve the current housing stock as well. And so I'm excited to have this conversation. And I think for the council, I'll be able to bring a real in-depth look at how we can actually increase supply and add to maintain our preservation of public housing across the District of Columbia.
So our first question, approximately 90,000 families live in apartments that are under DC's rent control program, which is currently up for reauthorization. The DC Council's temporary universal ban on rent increases exposes the need for increased tenant protections. What changes, if any, would you make to DC's rent control laws?
Well, let me first by saying that my family, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't come from a family that had wherewithal with financial success and disposable income. And so I understand the actual plight of families across Ward 7 and across the District of Columbia and across the nation that have been impacted by housing and the scarceness of housing affordability. And so with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, it has made what was already a challenge even that much more challenging. It has exacerbated the crisis that we find from a housing affordability standpoint. And so I applaud the DC Council for working very swiftly and working with the various advocacy groups to put forth meaningful legislation that helps to improve the lives and the actual outcomes of neighbors across Ward 7. And so as a council member, one of the things that I would do to add to and strengthen the overall bill is make sure that we eradicate predatory loopholes in our current law and strengthen the ones we have in our current bill. For example, families should not have to trade off their ability to live in a safe, sound, stable home that's updated and modernized for privileges to stay in their home by signing voluntary agreements. Also, we need to make sure that we enforce overall oversight on landlords that says that if you're a landlord, you own a property in the District of Columbia, then we expect you, we in fact mandate you to make sure you provide the necessary updates to make sure our neighbors and our friends and families are living in affordable, safe housing that's free from asthma, to improve social determinants of health, and to make sure that our kids have a future here in the District of Columbia. And so therefore landlords would not be able to apply for hardship petitions while allowing their buildings to become dilapidated and worn and tattered at the expense of our residents and our neighbors. We have to stop it. I think this bill that's being proposed is a good step in the right direction, but I think we can actually strengthen it even more to close more of those loopholes.
So as you referenced, the City Council has enacted legislation that prohibits rent increases during the state of emergency and prohibits evictions until 30 days after the public health crisis has ended. We know that nationally about a third of tenants could not pay their rent on April 1st. Given that over 87,000 DC workers have filed for unemployment in the last month, that may be higher in the district. While the DC courts are closed to the public, until recently, landlords were continuing to file eviction cases online in order to push evictions through as soon as possible. As the crisis continues, tenants will continue to fall behind on their rent and accrue debt. What would you do to address this crisis if you were on the council now?
Absolutely. If I represented all of my neighbors on Ward 7 as well as interests of wards across the district, I would even make an even bolder stance, because one thing that we know is this, is that our way of living is changing and has changed for the foreseeable future. The new normal is our current abnormal. COVID-19 has changed our housing, has changed our way of thinking about healthcare, has changed the way families earn living to be able to put a roof over their head and food on their table. And so as a council member, one of the things I would be a staunch advocate and supporter of is that let's go farther, let's be bolder. Let's make sure instead of 90 days in a moratorium, let's do instead of 30 days in a moratorium, let's do 90 days, because if tenants our neighbors were already struggling to pay their rents, what makes us think that after they've been furloughed, they've been laid off, their income has been vamped? What makes us think soon as the COVID-19 pandemic has passed us, that they're able to pick things right back up again and have a lump sum of money to pay back rent and arrearages? That's unfathomable. That's not the right thing we should do. And we should make sure that we have a true recovery plan to make sure that all of our residents across the District of Columbia and including Ward 7 have a reasonable, realistic time frame to be able to stay in their house, enjoy the freedoms, and thrive in place in their communities.
Great, thank you. The DC Housing Authority states that the 6,600 plus units of public housing need up to $2.5 billion in deferred maintenance and capital improvements. And the agency has charted a 20-year redevelopment plan. What would you like to see happen in public housing, and what would you do?
Well, the first thing for me is very simple, and it's very personal to me. I know exactly firsthand in real life that evictions have consequences and they have meaning to families. And I've experienced it in my childhood, and my entire family has grown up in public housing. So I understand the drastic impact that can have on a child's trajectory and where they end up as an adult. And so having known this and having gone through it through experience, as a council member, I will be steadfast and focused on this issue to make sure that children like myself, growing up as a young person, as an adult, they don't have to go through the obstacles that I went through. And so as a council member on the council, one of the things that I would look to do is I would look for opportunities to strengthen the public-private partnership by partnering with nonprofits and for-profits, because I believe we all have a combined interest in making sure that our residents across the district have access to quality, affordable, and stable housing. And what that could look like is this. Similar to what's happening in California, Google and Microsoft have stepped up to the table, and they understand that in order to have a productive, engaged workforce, then they have a role to play in housing. And so they're contributing monies to the Housing Production Trust Funds in the state of California. Also, a program that I'm currently working on with List Charlotte and List National is that we're looking at innovative ways to bring together a braided finance structure that takes into account public monies, private monies, and monies from other philanthropic groups to create a supplemental income stream that incentivizes direct developers to build more affordable, safe housing that has wraparound services to keep our residents in place. And so that's one major thing that I think we can do, we can add to the council immediately, is look at how we can innovate in housing and also use our traditional tools from a legislative standpoint to improve access and long-term capability of our housing supply.
Great, thank you. From encampment clearings to the threat of COVID outbreaks in shelters, we know that DC's homeless services programs are not working for many residents. How would you ensure that all DC residents have safe, quality, and affordable housing?
I think the first order of business is to actually fix it now. And what that means aggressively making sure that our homeless populations and our populations that are near homelessness have access to rapid rehousing. And not just on a confined 30, 40, 60 day, but provide the necessary resources so our families feel safe, they feel wanted, and they have the atmosphere for them to thrive in place until we develop a strategy, a long-term strategy to ensure the safeness and soundness of their families right here in the District of Columbia. And so as a council member, I will advocate for increased funding for rapid rehousing, make sure that we address the continuum of housing, looking at homelessness, looking at our renters, and also looking at home ownership, and look at it from a process standpoint and take a comprehensive view of what housing means for the district and how can we safeguard our residents to make sure that they can stay in place and they are not impacted by the negative downward pressures of gentrification that we're seeing happen all across the District of Columbia. So those are just two of the immediate things that I'll work on. But from a long-term perspective, we have to ascertain exactly why and what's the reason for homelessness in DC. We need to bring together partners from a Department of Behavioral Health. We need to add more resources to caseworkers to make sure that we're identifying job needs for reskilling and retraining. We need to also make sure that we are creating communities that are able to thrive in place by reintroducing family members and continue to strengthen and build the bonds of families across all of our communities, across all of our wards. So those are some of the things that as a council member I will look to do. But in short term, and to round it all up, I think there's a comprehensive approach to homelessness that we need to take, taking into consideration the elements I mentioned around behavioral health, jobs, housing, and access to quality, stable health care.
Great. So this next one is the 1-minute question. So we've talked now about DC's affordable housing crisis with respect to rent control, public housing, and homelessness. What would your top 3 priorities be in the area of housing as a council member?
The first thing that I would want to focus on is making sure that we are focused on not only on preservation, but we're focusing on supply as well, and looking at different levers that we can pull from either zoning, revisiting our zoning laws to allow more density in areas where it's applicable, but also looking at working with developers, as I mentioned earlier, to build that public-private partnership to incentivize developers to become environmental social governance type organization or social impact investors, to pull together those different capital structures and financial streams to supplement our current light tech offerings as well. And so, those are a couple. And then the other thing I would look at is make sure we're enforcing our discrimination policies, making sure that regardless of your sex, creed, race, religion, sexual orientation, that you're not discriminated. And then finally, the third piece is that I'm a big proponent of innovating. How can we put together the biggest and brightest practices that are being leveraged in our country and other countries throughout the world and bring them right here to DC?
Great, thanks. So the impact of coronavirus has also revealed the lack of a real safety net for workers in DC, particularly undocumented workers and those working in the informal and gig economies. How would you address these issues?
I think it comes down to the availability of resources and making sure we have one principle in mind, that we are one DC, and every resident within the geographical boundaries of DC is a resident in DC, and we care for them and we care about their safety and their well-being. I think if we approach all of our policies from that standpoint, we'll see improved policies that impact a broader population across the district. And so one of the things that I will look to do is make sure that there is no partnership or collaboration between the federal government and DC as it relates to immigration. We need to respect our undocumented workers and our gig workers in this modern day economy, and make sure that they have the necessary resources from a training standpoint, making sure that they have access to quality, affordable housing that is truly affordable, and that they're not paying more than 30% of their take-home income or gross annual income. And then the third thing that I would say is that we need to make sure that we bring the programs and services that are needed by our residents to the communities in which they live. Right now, we have a very centralized model with all of our services, most of the services located in a certain sector of the community. I want to make sure that that's equitably distributed across Ward 7 and across all wards. And I think taking a comprehensive approach to working with our immigrant brothers and sisters and having compassion and having empathy will work not only to benefit our immigrant population brothers and sisters, but also help to raise the economic tide across all of the wards across the District of Columbia.
Great. And this is the last question. The coronavirus pandemic has brought to the forefront issues of systemic inequalities in DC. We know that about 79% of the COVID-19 related deaths in DC were Black residents, who only make up about 46% of the population. What do you see as some of the underlying factors contributing to these disparities, and what would you do to tackle this?
Absolutely. So the COVID, as you mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has really uncovered what we already knew to be true, is that Black and brown communities across Ward 7, Ward 8, and in other wards across the district have been disproportionately marginalized, disenfranchised, and have received a minimum amount of resources from a city that's very prosperous as compared to other cities and even some states around the nation. And so seeing that we already have disparities in education, in health, in access to food sources, to access to training and jobs, we have to understand that this is an opportunity for us to be bold and for us to reset that paradigm to make sure that we are equitably distributing housing. We have workforce development programs in our communities that need them the most, making sure that we fully fund our schools and bring back vocational training that allows our students to have alternate pathways to progress, to actually stay in the District of Columbia, to buy houses, to have health care, to raise their families, and to thrive in place and age gracefully here. And then the other piece about it is this, that we not only must look at this as a social justice issue, we have to look at this as a human rights issue. And I believe all residents across the district, regardless of all of the protected statuses, require the same treatment under the government, because we're all taxpayers and we are our brother's keepers, and we have to start behaving like it and having the political will to not posture, but to represent the best interests of all of our neighbors and residents across the district.
Hi, my name is Anthony Lorenzo Green. I'm a Ward 7 DC Council candidate, a third-generation Washingtonian, a four-term advisory neighborhood commissioner, former vice president of the Deanwood Citizens Association, and I am a community activist that is running for council because I believe that working class families deserve to have a voice at the table down at the Wilson building. Over the last decade, I have been working hard to ensure that we're fighting for public safety that's accountable, making sure that we're committed to our fight to expand access to affordable grocery options, which is why I'm fighting now to ensure that we have a model that puts residents in place of ownership of our grocery stores and build equity in it, along with a pipeline of jobs. We're also committed to ensure that we are creating a space for education to be expanded for all, and supporting our teachers, making sure that our schools are funded fairly. So we have a big plate of issues that's before us, but I know that when it comes to housing, we have to make sure that housing is a human right for all.
Thank you. So the first question is, you'll have 3 minutes to answer. It's approximately 90,000 families live in apartments that are under DC's rent control program, which is currently up for reauthorization. And the DC Council's temporary universal ban on all rent increases exposes the need for increased tenant protections. What changes, if any, would you make to DC's rent control laws?
I support the Reclaim Rent Control Coalition platform in its entirety. The moment is now to expand and strengthen rent control laws, not just reauthorizing the status quo for another 10 years, but as a city, we must make clear that housing is a human right. By fighting for affordable rent-controlled housing, expanding the law to protect more tenants and closing loopholes, like eliminating predatory voluntary agreements, will put us on the right path for affordable housing for all. As someone that has faced eviction and homelessness early in my life, I fully understand the struggles of everyday working families trying to survive in DC. I'm committed to being intentional in oversight of the Housing Reduction Trust Fund to ensure we're actually creating and preserving affordable housing. We also must hear the voices from our communities that are telling us every day that what's being labeled affordable is not truly affordable for working class families. As a council member, I'm committed to passing legislation for deeply affordable housing across the city, not just east of the river. We also need to increase investment in the local rent supplement program be intentional in supporting the establishment of tenant associations at all apartment buildings, expanding investment in the Office of the Tenant Advocate. And as a city, we must be committed to supporting limited equity co-ops and listening to the call from community leaders demanding that we explore social housing policies.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next question. The City Council has enacted legislation that prohibits rent increases during the state of emergency and prohibits evictions until 30 days after the public health crisis has ended. So we know that nationally, a third of tenants couldn't pay their rent on April 1st. Given that over 87,000 DC workers have filed for unemployment in the last month, that statistic might be even higher here in the district. And while the courts in DC are closed to the public, landlords continue to file eviction cases online so that they can push evictions through as soon as possible. As the crisis continues, tenants will continue to fall behind on their rent and accrue debt. What would you do to address this if you were on the council?
If I was on the DC Council, I would have fought hard to suspend rent payments. It's unconscionable to order families to stay home during this COVID-19 pandemic while expecting us to continue to pay rent. Freezing rent increases isn't enough. As a council member, I would, as I am now, advocating and pushing for complete rent cancellations. It's my duty to protect the residents, and I know working families shouldn't have to sacrifice basic amenities to keep a roof over their heads while the world figures out how to respond to this pandemic. My recent analysis of the DC budget informs residents that we have the reserves to cover half of the COVID-19 losses with federal aid. Landlords and business entities can apply for loans and grants larger than what they would have received from Ward 7 renters. In addition, I would immediately fight for increased investment in the local rent supplement program. And I know I mentioned this earlier, but we have to be very intentional and serious about expanding our options to support renters. Residents, especially our seniors, will not be able to recover from lost wages, system errors in the unemployment insurance program, and additional health costs. As we fight to implement the equitable changes needed to create a caring economy, it will be my goal to find dedicated funding to keep the road of recovery for Ward 7 residents sustainable. That includes working to create a fair and progressive tax structure.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, the DC Housing Authority states that the 6,600 plus units of public housing need up to 2.5 billion in deferred maintenance and capital improvements, and the agency has charted a 20-year redevelopment plan. What would you like to see happen in public housing, and what would you do?
The city can take incremental steps to repair and maintain public housing. But first, we need to ensure the DC Housing Authority upholds the morals of housing as a human right. And as someone that serves on Advisory Neighborhood Commission 7C, where we have the housing complex of Lincoln Heights and Clay Terrace, we know, which are part of the whole New Communities Initiative, we know the struggles firsthand. We're basically on the front lines of trying to make sure that we have a housing authority that's accountable and answers to the residents, as opposed to dictating to us what type of development should be inflicted. And we all already know that a lot of the development that we've been seeing across the city has been displacing so many families for years. But as a councilman, it will be important for me to track expenses, construction, and data about our public housing unit. I want to ensure repairs are not ill-fitting, increase resident standards of living, and connect them to the resources to thrive in our city. In addition, there are some green infrastructure that can be fitted while repairs to units are happening. Some of these can include solar panels, which create on-site energy generation, so residents only pay a small percentage of their energy needs to a utility company. Energy efficient appliances like refrigerators, washer and dryers, and dishwashers use less energy and reduce up their bills. Making sure that we have windows, they're called low E windows, have a special coating that reflects interior temperatures back inside, keeping homes warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. Insulated walls keep heated and cooled air in and outside air out, meaning residents can save on heating and cooling bills. But finally, I, along with other council members, will be looking to ensure public housing has dedicated funding sources with legislation that prohibits the mayor from using those funds for other uses.
Thank you. The next question is from encampment clearings to the threat of COVID outbreaks in shelters. We know that DC's homeless services programs are not working for many residents. How would you ensure that all DC residents have safe, quality, and affordable housing?
Thank you for that question. It's a very important question. Currently, I've been looking into the idea of the vacant luxury tax. This will require property owners who receive DC tax money for the development to either pay the rental costs of one of their vacant units or to relinquish that unit to a resident or residents experiencing homelessness. The money collected will go to a dedicated funding stream to build more affordable housing and empower our homeless services programs. When working families pay more in local taxes than the top 1%, we have a lot more work to do to create a fair and progressive tax structure. As a council member, I will always fight against the creation of regressive taxes that burdens Ward 7 residents and fight for progressive taxes to equitably fund deeply affordable housing projects. A fair and progressive tax structure would provide the necessary funding and decrease the time it would take to end chronic homelessness. And as we look to shift the scales for working families to attain affordable housing, we must be more strategic about vetting directors for the Office of Planning and the Department of Housing and Community Development to ensure they align with our visions to end homelessness and make DC a city where everyone can find and afford housing below 50% of their paychecks. We need to ensure affordable housing is built throughout the city, including areas in wards 1 through 4, and build more family units. There are some proven systems that have ended chronic homelessness in cities like Bergen County, New Jersey, who immediately opened a 24 hours housing shelter that houses, feeds, and connects families to mental health, financial counseling, and automatically connects families to housing within 64 days. We must be very intentional in what we do every day to end homelessness.
Thank you. Okay, this next question is just 1 minute. So we've talked about DC's affordable housing crisis with respect to rent control, public housing, and homelessness. So we're asking you to list your top 3 housing priorities as a council member, and just the list is preferable.
Sure. Priority 1, ensuring the East of the River High-Risk Displacement Prevention Services and Fund Establishment Act of 2019 is funded and passed. This bill helps empower communities to be more involved in the development projects in their neighborhoods, find and obtain legal services, and help curb evictions. Priority 2, affordable ownership options. We need to reimagine housing, not only just as a human right, but also as a concept. For many, housing is a business, one that locks out, manipulates, and preys on Black families. To upset the status quo, we need to be working to open the doors for affordable ownership, more assistance for Ward 7 residents to create co-ops, own and lease property through community land trusts and resident-controlled community development corporation, and last, connective resources to wealth. The racial wealth gap is real, and we won't see the uplifting of residents in Ward 7 until we intentionally ensure employment services is connecting them to a sustainable employment with opportunities to rise and learn. That includes a free debt-free UDC for all.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, the impacts of coronavirus have also revealed the lack of a real safety net for workers in DC, particularly undocumented workers and those in the informal and gig economy. How would you address these issues?
First, we need to stop being vague about the meaning of a sanctuary city. It expands beyond having a safe place to hide from ICE. It's a village that protects, welcomes, and celebrates any resident. The recent actions of the council and the mayor to exclude immigrant and non-traditional works are inhumane and toxic, the complete opposites of the definition of a sanctuary city. As an independent contractor, I know there are ways to look at tax codes to create a UI system that covers non-traditional workers. We want to be worried about creating a system that restricts and complicates informal work. As Events DC, for example, has shown 2 years in a row, they have reserves of DC tax dollars in a bank account It may be time to look into other agencies who may have cash flow and divert funding to establishing a fair and equitable system for all workers. And someone that used to be unemployment compensation claims adjudicator from 2013 to 2017, I know firsthand about the battle for many of us in that agency who were part of the AFG Local 1000 union who have fought for years for an upgraded unemployment system. It's a shame that it's taken almost a decade for folks to realize that people have been kicking this can down the road. And this is our moment right now to create a more equitable system so that we're not leaving so many workers behind. COVID-19 should not be the crisis to finally expose this large loophole. And so as council member, I'll be working with Black and Brown communities and informal workers to create more systems to protect our investments and finances.
Okay, thank you. This is the last question. So the coronavirus pandemic has brought to the forefront issues of systemic inequalities in DC. We know that 79% of COVID-related deaths, and that numbers as of April 14th in DC, were Black residents, who only make up about 46% of the population. What do you see as some of the underlying factors contributing to these disparities, and what would you do to tackle them?
Years of broken promises from politicians that have been bought and paid for by big business and the special interests have created this problem. Generations of Ward 7 residents have marched, protested, and testified for a comprehensive healthcare system, only to watch council members pay without tax dollars for projects west of the river. The health inequalities causing nearly 80% of COVID-19 deaths have a direct correlation to the non-existent urgent care, trauma, and mental health centers in Ward 7 and across east of the river. The current Ward 7 council member chairs the DC Council Health Committee, and he has proposed no actions based on the discovery that Ward 7 has some of the highest rates of COVID-19 infections, including in Lincoln Heights and over in Hillcrest community. In conjunction, that lack of access to healthy food and economic assets left ignored for decades has forced generations of Ward 7 families to not only shop at small convenience stores for food, but to accept chains of greasy foods as the norm, while healthy variations open up elsewhere. To tackle these issues, I want to ensure the Racial Equity Achieves Results Amendment Act of 2019, also known as the RARE Act, is passed and used to analyze the budget. This should help fellow council members understand the final needs to eliminate these disparities. In addition to that, we have to be intentive in listening and welcoming residents in marginalized communities to give input on legislation so that it is shaped by our experiences. I am thankful for the many people that have contributed to our campaign as far as expanding the vision for Ward 7. My campaign is built on the foundations that we, Ward 7, are a village. We will look after each other before the interests of those only looking to monopolize. These things will not happen if we're not honest about the disparities in access to housing, resources, and wealth for Black residents in DC.
My name is Rebecca Morris. I am originally from Washington, D.C. I am currently running for Ward 7 City Council member. I am a waiter, and I'm a 15-year resident, a native of Ward 7.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first question. Approximately 90,000 families live in apartments that are under DC's rent control program, which is currently up for reauthorization. The DC Council's temporary universal ban on all rent increases exposes the need for increased tenant protections. What changes, if any, would you make to DC's rent control laws?
Well, I would make sure that I do agree that at this current time that there needs to be a ban on for the rent increase, as well as the late fees. But I will also want to, I guess it goes a little bit into the second question, as far as in giving people enough time to allowing people to pay rent just because of this current situation. There's many families who have yet to receive any unemployment or can't work. So I think if we had a little bit of extension, so to give some time when we reopen so that people can pay their rent. So those are things that I would like to extend.
This one's a long one. The City Council has enacted legislation that prohibits rent increases during the state of emergency and prohibits evictions until 30 days after the public health crisis has ended. We know that nationally, 1/3 of tenants could not pay their rent on April 1st, given that over 87,000 DC workers have filed for unemployment in the last month. That statistic may be higher in the district. While the courts in DC are closed to the public, landlords continue to file eviction cases online so that they can push evictions through as soon as possible. As the crisis continues, tenants will continue to fall behind on their rent and accrue a debt. What would you do to address this if you were on the council?
Well, as a person who has went through this, who didn't receive unemployment until just now, and I still have coworkers who haven't received anything at all. One thing that I would change or add on is that I would allow 6 months after the reopen. So it takes because a lot of businesses, once this thing is over, a lot of business would be failing, depending on whatever genre. If you're in the restaurant industry, some businesses have closed down. It takes about 3 months to get a brand new job, just on average. And once you get that job, I think 3 months is a good enough time to just pay off what you need to pay, as well as if you had backup unemployment, you should have received it by then once we reopen. So you'll have the backup unemployment money plus the new job money. So I think 6 months after the reopen is a good enough time to start going towards having people pay off their rent without facing evictions.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, question 3. So the DC Housing Authority states that 6,600 plus units of public housing need up to $2.5 billion in deferred maintenance and capital improvements, and the agency has charted a 20-year redevelopment plan. What would you like to see happen in public housing, and what would you do?
Well, what the current state of public housing is disgusting. The way that we treat people in public housing when people ask for improvements such as mold. There's a lot of people who live inside their homes with mold, rats, roaches. They've been reporting. I have coworkers. I know people who's been reporting for years on this and have yet to receive any feedback, any help. So I can put a face on some of these issues, and they've just stopped fixing it up. They stopped fixing it because they want to do these improvements. They're about to they're trying to sell these buildings off so they can cut the defer or cut down the building so they can rebuild it up. I think it's disgusting. And one thing I would like to have done is when somebody's reporting something, it doesn't matter whether they're going to shut down that building tomorrow or today. If someone's living in mold, you have to do something about it. If someone's living in a rat-infested place, you have to do something about it because that is a health risk. That we shouldn't be deferring some of these building maintenance. It's a health risk, and we shouldn't be ignoring people who are living in these conditions. So those are one of those things, have some sort of oversight for public housing and not just a government agency. Yes, we need government agencies, but I also think if there's a community association where they hold people accountable, or they hold us accountable for the conditions in which they live in so that they can get what they need.
Great, thanks. Okay, so this is the 4th question. From encampment clearings to the threat of COVID outbreaks in shelters, we know that DC's homeless services programs are not working for many residents. How would you ensure that all DC residents have safe, quality, and affordable housing?
This is a 2-part question. There are some homeless people in which we see that oftentimes live on Georgetown, and Union Station who do not want to live in homes. They enjoy living in tents. And that is a valid, I think those people who want to do that and live off the land, who go off fishing inside the Potomac River, I think those citizens, if they want to do that in the city in which we live, we should allow them to do that in which we live. That's if it's safe for them, if that's how they want to live, we should allow that. But I also think that in DC, if someone has a full-time job, there should be in all buildings, and we should be cutting deals with landlords to allow people to do income-based housing. If you work a full-time job, what at minimum wage, we should have something that goes around like around your income. When we talk about affordability, if you work at $15 an hour, you can't afford a $2,000 rent. For some, they consider that affordable housing, or $1,500 rent as affordable housing. That's not affordable at all. So I think if we do more income-based housing, so that people do not have to scam, do not have to run to do things such as creating fake pay stubs just to get an apartment, or living 8 people in a 1-bedroom home. These are things like I personally have lived in a 6-person home, in a 2-bedroom home with 6 people and a dog, just so we can keep a roof over our head. So just so we don't have to resort to being homeless, I think if we do more so income-based, get rid of the word affordability and do income-based, that way we won't have so many people who would consider themselves homeless.
Thanks. Okay, let's see. So the next question is the 1-minute question. So we've talked about DC's affordable housing crisis with respect to rent control, public housing, and homelessness. What would be your top 3 priorities related to housing as a council member? Please just list them.
I would say putting a handle on the rent control. If you do the rent control, everything else should be able to follow along with it. Most people in general pay the market rent. And most people actually do want to, most people in our area. So if we can save most people, everything else, all the laws in which we have and policies that we put in place can just fall right under, and it'll create a safety net, because if we're not saving the majority, then there will be more people who's trying to apply for public housing, which we don't have enough housing for that, or there will be more people who's going to have to be in shelters, and we don't have the time, like we just don't have the space for that. So if we save that, then we'll have enough time, or we'll have enough resources.
Thanks. Okay, so the next question goes back. It's a 3-minute question again. So the impacts of the coronavirus have also revealed the lack of a real safety net for workers in DC, particularly undocumented workers and those working in the informal and gig economy. How would you address these issues? Okay,
there's 2 things. In DC, I'm not a gig worker. I work off tips. So there's 2 things. Our main economy is government and tourism. And everyone in our city makes their money in that fashion and format. When the government's not working, no matter what field you're working in, that you're not going to make money. And with that being said, gig economy, when you work a gig, you kind of know the risk. You know the risk when you're going into it. And so most of the time you kind of work a gig when you're trying to do something in lieu of, when you're in between spaces. A lot of people currently right now, they have their regular job. They're not sure what's going to happen. They're doing their gig work. So you go in knowing that risk, that this is supposed to be temporary. Even if it's not temporary, you really can't give a safety net, because you know the risk. You just save for your rainy days. When you know the risk, you just know. Even for undocumented workers, and I have friends who are undocumented workers, a lot of them are still working currently. And even with that, you kind of know the risks when you're going in, and you're going into a country and you're doing something that you know that you're not supposed to do, but you're here for a limit. You're here for a goal. For many undocumented workers, they're here for the goal. They're here to work. for a certain amount of time to go back to save whatever the money they need to save, to go back home, to feed their families. And so when you know that going in, you know that the safety net isn't going to be there for you. So you work in a sense, you work in a way, you keep a skill, you always keep a skill. Even if this restaurant, if you're not a cook right now, you know how to paint real well, you're working in construction. So it's like you go in knowing that risk. So when you already know, there isn't going to be a safety net.
Thanks. Okay, this is the last question. The coronavirus pandemic has brought to the forefront issues of systemic inequalities in DC. We know that 79% of the COVID-19 related deaths as of April 14th in DC were Black residents, who only make up about 46% of the population. What do you see as some of the underlying factors contributing to these disparities, and what would you do to tackle them?
In my opinion, the coronavirus, as a black citizen, also a member of Ward 7, it didn't bring up, like, it did, but it didn't. A lot of people in Ward 7 has been complaining about the basic necessities. People have been complaining for decades for affordable, about housing, how about their housing conditions, having mold or rats or roaches in their homes, or they need fixing, which causes for asthma. A lot of people have been begging for a hospital for a long period of time. People have been begging for a grocery store for a long period of time. We've been begging for this for a long period of time, and our cries have oftentimes been ignored. So it hasn't been the corona. It's just now that it's not the fact that it's just now being exposed. It's just now being listened to, because now that if a large portion of Black people have this disease that other ethnicities can catch, they put themselves at risk. But other than that, if it was something just within our community that they couldn't catch, it would still be ignored. So it just, if I was city council member, I for the most part want to put the basic necessities such as safety. I want to enforce proper housing in our communities, grocery stores, a proper healthcare system in our area. We just need the basics. That's all we ask for, the basics.